A German reconnaissance patrol crawled through the spruce trees of the Hürtgen Forest in the gray hour before dawn, sometime in the autumn of 1944, with orders about as old as organized warfare itself. There's an American position one ridge over. It's been quiet for a day and a half. Find out who's holding it, how many, and what they intend to do next. Get close, watch, listen, count. Soldiers had been doing exactly this for roughly 2,000 years of recorded military history. What German reconnaissance patrols on the Western Front had specifically been trained to look for, though, was something more particular than just enemy soldiers. The small signs, in the language of their own doctrine, the traces a unit inevitably leaves scattered across ground it has occupied. A ration can stamped with a specific division's markings told a trained scout who had been there. A bandage wrapper with a manufacturer's code told him roughly when. A particular tread pattern in the mud told him how they had arrived. A half-burned letter, if he was lucky, told him when the men had last been paid and which town back home they'd come from. From these fragments, a division-level intelligence officer, an IC officer in German staff shorthand, built his picture of the enemy, one recovered scrap at a time. The patrol that reached the empty American position that morning found the ground exactly that, empty. Not merely quiet, genuinely, unsettlingly bare. The foxholes had been filled back in and tamped down. The slit trenches were collapsed and covered over. Whatever ration containers had once been there were gone, buried, or burned somewhere the scouts couldn't locate. No cigarette butts, no scraps of paper. The latrines had been filled in and disguised under branches and leaves. No shoulder patches discarded in the trash because there was no trash. No letters from home because the letters had already been burned. The patrol went back to its own lines and made its report, and the IC officer reading it would have asked the only sensible question available to him. Are you certain they were actually there? Yes. Depressions in the leaf litter where men had clearly slept. Faint tire tracks near the road. Americans, without question. But which division? Which regiment? In what strength for how long and heading where? The ground itself had nothing left to say. That kind of report kept coming back to German intelligence officers across the Western Front through 1944 and into 1945. And the specific word that shows up again and again in post-war interrogations to describe their reaction isn't anger, and it isn't quite frustration either. It's a more precise word than either of those, rätselhaft. Baffling in the sense of something that resists interpretation altogether rather than something merely difficult to solve. To understand why an empty foxhole could genuinely baffle a professional intelligence officer rather than simply annoy him, you have to go back to a small office inside the U.S. War Department on February 15th, 1940, 21 months before Pearl Harbor. And a 38-page manual that almost no popular history of the Second World War ever mentions by name, one that quietly taught an entire army how to become invisible to an enemy it hadn't met yet. To understand what actually broke for the Germans, you first have to understand what a German intelligence officer was trained to expect. The Wehrmacht inherited a doctrine of ground reconnaissance running back through the Prussian general staff to the Napoleonic era, built on three pillars: aerial reconnaissance from the Luftwaffe, signals intelligence from dedicated interception regiments, and ground reconnaissance carried out by scouts on foot, the Spähtruppe. Of the three, the men walking the ground were the most intimate source of all. The Luftwaffe could spot a vehicle column from altitude, signals crews could pluck a stray radio transmission out of the air, but only a scout could physically walk into a position the enemy had just abandoned and read it the way a forensic examiner reads a wound. German doctrine even had a specific phrase for exactly this task: Spuren sichern, to secure the traces, to gather and document the physical evidence a departing unit inevitably leaves behind. The signed scouts were trained to hunt fell into four broad categories: identification, anything naming the unit itself, a shoulder patch, a letter's return address, a ration depot stamp, strength, anything implying numbers, latrine capacity, the footprint of ground that had clearly been slept on, intent, anything suggesting direction of travel, vehicle tracks, whether position looked hastily abandoned or carefully struck, and condition, anything hinting at morale, an unburned letter's tone, fingernail marks scratched into a trench wall during a bad shelling. From those fragments, a competent IC officer built a map. From the map, he gave his commander an estimate. From the estimate, the division actually moved. This tradecraft was old, and on the Eastern Front it had continued working spectacularly well. Soviet positions, by the consistent account of German reports, yielded genuine mountains of evidence: cigarette papers, discarded copies of Pravda, Cyrillic-marked ration tins, family photographs, identity papers. German scouts on that front rarely came back genuinely empty-handed. Then the Wehrmacht started meeting Americans, first in Tunisia in 1942 and 1943, then Sicily and Italy, then Normandy, the long retreat across France, and finally the West Wall and the forests along the German frontier. By the autumn of 1944, after nearly 2 years of intermittent contact, the same specific observation kept recurring in German reports. American positions, once captured or simply vacated, consistently yielded far less identifying material than positions left by any other Allied army. The Italians had left mountains of material behind. The British left a considerable amount. The French, somewhat less. The Americans left next to nothing at all. German officers didn't yet know why, and the explanations they reached for were the reasonable ones available inside their own framework. Perhaps American supply was so lavish that individual soldiers simply didn't bother holding on to personal effects, or perhaps it reflected some particular national fastidiousness about cleanliness. The actual explanation, that an entire army had been deliberately drilled for roughly a year and a half before Pearl Harbor in the specific, unglamorous tradecraft of denying a German intelligence officer his raw material, never seriously occurred to them. There was a structural reason it didn't, and we'll come back to exactly why. Hold that thought for a moment. A German scout walks into an empty American foxhole sometime in 1944, trained for years to read exactly what he finds there, and finds nothing. He carries that nothing back to his IC officer, who carries it forward to a division commander sitting over a map by candlelight in some requisitioned French chateau or Belgian farmhouse, a commander who now has to decide where the Americans will actually be tomorrow with essentially no usable data at all. He guesses. He guesses with whatever fragments he has, and across Italy, France, Belgium, and finally Germany itself, the accumulated weight of those bad guesses shaped decision after decision the German army made on the Western Front. Whether to hold a position, whether to fall back, whether to commit a precious reserve. One of the costliest of those guesses is buried quite literally in the topsoil of a foxhole somewhere in the Hürtgen Forest, filled back in by an American sergeant before his squad marched away. Of everything German scouts had ever been trained to identify, the one thing their doctrine had never taught them to properly interpret was absence itself. Spur and Sickern assumed as its baseline premise that traces existed to be secured. When they simply didn't exist, the doctrine had nothing left to say about it. An ordinary G1 in 1944 asked whether he understood himself to be executing a sophisticated counterintelligence strategy every time he filled in his own foxhole, would have looked at you blankly. He was just policing his area because his sergeant told him to, because that was simply the army. Where the army itself had actually learned it starts with a single document. You can find the actual document today in Box 4, Folder 57, of the Francis M. Woolburn Papers, held in special collections at San Diego State University. A 38-page paper-bound booklet carrying an official War Department seal, titled Basic Field Manual, Military intelligence, counterintelligence, serial number FM30-25, dated February 15th, 1940. That February, the entire United States Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men. Hitler had been at war for less than 5 months. Pearl Harbor sat 21 months in the future, and America remained officially, determinedly neutral. And inside a small office of the War Department's G2 intelligence section in Washington, a handful of staff officers were finishing a manual on a subject almost nobody outside that office particularly cared about yet. The manual's own stated purpose, in its actual period language, described counterintelligence measures as either negative, concealing American forces' true situation and intentions, or countering hostile propaganda inside American lines, or positive, meaning deliberately manufacturing false impressions in an enemy's mind about American capability and intent. Its table of contents alone tells you what its authors thought genuinely mattered. Section 2, Secrecy Discipline. Section 5, Preparation and Use of Documents. Section 7, Movements of Troops and Individuals. Section 9, Censorship. Sections 2 and 7 matter most for this specific story. Section 2 lays out a principle so deceptively simple that most of the rest of the world's armies didn't formally adopt an equivalent until well into the 1950s. That secrecy isn't the specialized job of some separate intelligence branch. It's the daily responsibility of every individual soldier. That's worth pausing on, because it genuinely isn't how most armies had ever operated up to that point. In the Wehrmacht, in the Red Army, in the British Army, through most of their own histories, secrecy was largely something officers and dedicated intelligence personnel handled. An ordinary sergeant and his squad were responsible for their own weapons and their own orders, and the larger intelligence picture belonged to somebody else entirely. The 1940 American Manual said otherwise, that secrecy was a discipline exactly like cleaning a rifle, or saluting, or keeping your boots dry, and that every soldier was already a participant in the counterintelligence fight, whether he understood it that way or not, purely by virtue of what he chose to leave behind or not leave behind. Section 7 contains the actual doctrinal seed of everything this story is really about, in a paragraph titled, "In Genuinely Deadpan Army Prose, Precautions Prior to Departure." It instructed that, before any unit moved out of an occupied area, that unit would erase or conceal any evidence of its own identity, strength, and intentions. Foxholes filled, trash buried or burned, documents fully accounted for, equipment markings concealed. The language was almost aggressively unremarkable. The implication buried inside it was enormous. Did many people actually read FM 30-25 in February 1940? Honestly, very few. It was distributed in small numbers with no mass training program built around it yet, because there was no war yet to train for. But doctrine documents in a peacetime army have a strange second life. They become curriculum. When the Army began its explosive expansion after September 1940, from 200,000 men to well over 1 million within a single year, and eventually past 8 million by 1945, the manuals quietly drafted in that small Washington office became the actual syllabus for training cadres being stood up all across the country. By the time America formally entered the war that December, every man in basic training was being told, somewhere in his first few weeks, that policing his own area wasn't a chore invented purely to torment him. It was, whether he grasped it fully or not, a counterintelligence operation he and his comrades were already running against an enemy he hadn't met yet. The discipline expanded from there. The Soldier's Handbook, FM 21-100, published that December, devoted an entire chapter to marches, camps, and bivouacs that simply took for granted no American unit would ever leave a bivouac without policing it thoroughly first. A full quarter century before "Leave No Trace" became a familiar slogan among American hikers, it was already the standing operating principle of the American Infantry Division. I think the detail that actually matters most here isn't the manual itself, interesting as it is as an artifact. It's that the discipline it described had to survive actual contact with real exhaustion, real fear, and real combat to mean anything at all. Because doctrine is one thing on a printed page, and a frozen, terrified private in a Belgian forest at midnight, who hasn't slept properly in 3 days, being told by his sergeant to fill his own foxhole back in before the platoon moves out, is something else entirely. The genuine achievement here isn't that this discipline got written down in 1940. It's that it actually held for 4 straight years across 3 continents, carried out by millions of men who never fully understood the strategic weight of what they were doing. There's a small, almost universal ritual that shows up, usually in passing, in a huge number of American memoirs from this war, often without the veteran writing it down, seeming to realize it's the actual subject of a much larger story. It happens just before a unit pulls out of a position it has occupied for any length of time, sometimes ordered from above, sometimes simple rotation to the rear, sometimes a line being reorganized. The reason never really mattered. The ritual itself did. A sergeant gives the order, police the area. 2 words and an enormous amount of actual labor packed inside them, the same filled foxholes and buried trash the German scout in our opening scene found nothing of, except now with a specific tradecraft behind it, spelled out. A collapsed latrine wasn't simply covered. It was scuffed over afterward with a branch, specifically to disguise the telltale straight edge a shovel leaves in fresh dirt. Discarded ration boxes weren't just tossed aside. The waxed cardboard, which an experienced German scout could reportedly spot from 50 paces, even half buried, got folded flat before burning or burial, specifically to reduce its visible footprint. Letters were the genuinely difficult part of the discipline, because a letter from a wife or a mother is, by a wide margin, the single most information-dense object an ordinary soldier carries on his body. A return address, specific dates, and frequently, despite official censorship, oblique references to a man's actual posting or to named people in his own unit. One single intact letter, recovered by a German scout and carried back to an IC officer, could in principle compromise an entire battalion's security. The rule, accordingly, was that letters were never simply discarded. They were burned individually, the ashes scattered by hand, or, during an orderly withdrawal, handed off to the unit's own mail clerk for proper evacuation instead. They were never, under any circumstance, just thrown away. A young paratrooper named John Jack Cummings, serving with Company A of the 276th Infantry Regiment, reportedly learned exactly how seriously the particular rule was enforced along the banks of the Rhine on December 29, 1944. By one fellow veteran's later account, the men of Company A were specifically told, as they moved into position along the river, to destroy any letters they were carrying and remove their own unit patches. Not as routine practice before any ordinary movement, but specifically because they were about to occupy ground where capture carried an unusually elevated risk, and their own command didn't want a captured man revealing which unit had actually crossed. Cummings was reportedly killed alone in his own foxhole on New Year's Eve, armed with a Browning automatic rifle, when a German raiding party crossed the river that night. Only his helmet, with a bullet hole through it, was later recovered, and his body itself wasn't formally identified for well over 7 decades afterward. Part of that long delay, according to post-war Army casualty records, traced directly back to the fact that he and his comrades had simply carried out the order they'd been given as instructed. No patches, no letters, nothing on his body to indicate which specific American unit he'd actually belonged to. The same discipline built to deny a German intelligence officer, his data had also, in a small and genuinely sad way, made it considerably harder for Cummings's own family to eventually bring him home. Multiply that single sergeant's order across an entire army and 2 full years of continuous combat. And the cumulative effect is the near-total disappearance of an entire evidentiary ecosystem German tradecraft had always assumed would simply exist. A German scout walking into an abandoned American position in 1944 wasn't failing to find evidence because Americans happened to be lucky or careless. He was failing because every single American he was searching for had already been drilled for as long as 18 months before he ever boarded a troop ship, in the precise, small motions that erased exactly the kind of signs he'd spent his own career learning to read. Field strip the cigarette, bury the can, burn the box, fill the hole, cover the latrine, remove the patch, pocket the letter. 12 words, in total, cover essentially the entire counterintelligence campaign the United States Army ran on the Western Front, boiled down to its actual working parts. Was the discipline perfectly universal? Of course not. Some units were simply more disciplined than others, some sergeants stricter, and plenty of battalions caught in a genuinely fast, chaotic withdrawal left considerably more behind than doctrine called for. Surviving German intelligence reports occasionally describe, with something close to open delight, the rare American position that had been imperfectly policed, precisely because those reports were the documented exception rather than anything resembling the norm. The rule across most of the Western Front, by the weight of the surviving evidence, was the empty field. And here's the part that actually matters most in the whole story. The American soldiers carrying this out had no real idea they were waging a counterintelligence campaign at all. They believed, almost universally, that they were simply keeping their own area clean. The institutional layer that had actually designed the discipline, and the layer that understood exactly why it mattered strategically, stayed almost completely invisible to the men executing it on the ground. And that specific opacity was, in its own way, a genuine strength. A man carries out a strategic operation with total reliability precisely when he doesn't know he's carrying one out at all. He simply does what his sergeant tells him. The Germans, meanwhile, were trying to read fields that had effectively been swept clean by roughly 12 million janitors who had no idea they were the custodians of an active intelligence operation. Which raises the obvious next question. Why couldn't German intelligence, with its own considerable sophistication and its long, successful track record in the East, simply adapt and catch up? The honest answer is that they tried, and structurally they couldn't, for 3 distinct reasons, each one revealing something different about how the two armies actually differed. The first reason is structural. The systematic, automatic, every soldier, everyday practice the Americans had built directly out of FM 30-25 simply had no real equivalent anywhere in the standard German training pipeline. That wasn't because German planners had never considered the idea. It is because, for most of the war on the Eastern Front, they genuinely never needed to. The Red Army's sheer scale and often chaotic mobilization meant Soviet units were, on the whole, considerably less disciplined about what they left behind, and German scouts operating in the East could reliably count on finding usable traces. The whole intelligence ecosystem simply worked as designed, with no real operational pressure to invent anything different. When German forces first met American units in North Africa in 1942 and 1943, they clearly noticed the contrast, and generally read it as an oddity of national character. Americans were wealthier, better supplied, apparently more casual about their own personal effects, without it seriously occurring to them that the entire pattern was the product of deliberate, centrally designed training. The second reason is documentary. By April 1943, German forces on the Eastern Front had begun stripping identifying markings off vehicles, the Heeresgruppe Mitte directive of that April, an early precursor to what historians now generally call the Kursk markings order. But this was a narrow fix applied specifically at the vehicle level, not at the level of an individual soldier's own bivouac, and it was a reactive measure, prompted specifically by German fears that improving Soviet reconnaissance might start using those very markings to track German divisions in the field. It was never part of a doctrine taught from basic training upward the way FM 30-25 was. A German scout walking into an empty American foxhole simply had nothing remotely comparable sitting in his own kit bag. There was no Wehrmacht equivalent of precautions prior to departure, existing as a standalone training subject at the individual squad level. The third reason is cultural, and it's the hardest of the three to discuss with real precision, since cultural explanations for military outcomes are frequently wrong or overstated. But post-war German interrogation records are remarkably consistent on this specific point. Wehrmacht soldiers routinely carried and left behind letters from home, personal photographs, identity documents, and, notably, extensive personal diaries, a genuine habit among a significant number of German troops, and one major reason Allied interrogators found German prisoners such a productive intelligence source throughout the war. Allied order of battle intelligence on the Western Front was built substantially out of exactly this kind of captured German paperwork. Put those three factors together: doctrine that never pushed secrecy discipline down to the individual soldier, vehicle markings addressed only reactively while bivouac discipline stayed essentially untouched, and a persistent cultural habit of carrying and losing deeply personal material. And the practical result wasn't an outright military disaster on its own. German forces could and repeatedly did win individual engagements throughout the war. But it meant that in the specific, asymmetric intelligence contest running underneath the entire Western Front campaign, a German IC officer was permanently working from underneath an American G2 officer's actual picture of the battlefield. The documented record bears this out clearly. Starting in November 1942, the Western Front Committee at Bletchley Park began systematically building order of battle assessments of German forces stationed in the West. And by D-Day, that June, the committee had successfully identified all 58 German divisions then stationed across France and the Low Countries. Germany, for all its own considerable effort, never built anything close to a comparable picture of Allied dispositions in return. American troop strength massing across southern England before D-Day was consistently and badly underestimated by German intelligence. Patton's entirely fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, sitting in Kent and broadcasting convincing fake radio traffic, was believed genuine by German planners well after real Allied forces had already broken out of the Normandy bocage. The post-war Hill Project at Camp Ritchie, nearly 200 captured Wehrmacht officers working under American supervision through 1945 and 1946, specifically tasked with reconstructing an honest German-side picture of the war, recorded exactly the same recurring bewilderment in the careful, measured language professional military officers tend to use even in defeat. We could not see them. We did not know what we were looking at. The ground we walked over was simply bare. That specific bareness is the real answer to why bafflement, rather than mere frustration, is the precise word that keeps appearing in these records. Frustration is what a professional feels when a genuine obstacle stands in his way. Bafflement is what he feels when there's nothing in his way at all, and he still somehow can't see. German intelligence officers spent years staring at empty American foxholes trying to work out what kind of trick they were witnessing. Deliberate evidence tampering, planted false signs, simple American carelessness born of excessive wealth. What their own doctrine had no real category for was the plain, almost domestic truth sitting underneath all of it. These men had simply been taught, for years, to pick up after themselves. If your father or grandfather served in the European theater, infantry, cavalry, engineers, signals, quartermaster, anywhere, and ever mentioned what it actually felt like to police a position before pulling out, I'd genuinely like to read that in the comments, because the voices of the men who actually did this specific, unglamorous work rarely make it into any standard history of the war. There's an army term that doesn't appear in most official histories nearly often enough. The police call itself. It's sometimes handed out with a faint smile as informal punishment duty, and veterans tend to describe it decades later with a specific affectionate irritation reserved for a chore that turned out, against all expectation, to have actually mattered. It never shows up in a war film. There's no dramatic scene built around a police call. It sits well below the notice of popular memory almost entirely, and yet for 4 straight years it functioned as the United States Army's primary tactical counterintelligence operation, executed daily by every infantryman, every clerk, every artillery crewman, every signal operator, and every cook in every single theater of the war. Denying a foreign intelligence service the raw material it needed to function, without the vast majority of the men actually doing the work ever being told that's precisely what they were doing. They believed they were just picking up trash. The full answer to why German scouts were specifically baffled rather than merely inconvenienced is that their entire reconnaissance tradition, like essentially every reconnaissance tradition in recorded military history, Roman scouts, Mongol riders, Napoleonic dragoons, rested on one unexamined assumption running back thousands of years. Soldiers leave things behind. They always have. A doctrine built to systematically break that single assumption didn't just produce a somewhat harder intelligence environment for the Germans to operate in. It produced an intelligence environment their own tradecraft had genuinely no vocabulary to describe at all. There was no existing playbook for the enemy. We'll simply leave nothing. And a patrol returning empty-handed inside the German intelligence framework of the period wasn't read as a patrol that had encountered a genuinely difficult opponent. It was recorded as a patrol that had failed at its assigned task, the system quietly blaming the men on the ground, when what those men were actually up against was a deliberately engineered void nobody back at headquarters had a name for. By December 1944, when Hitler finally launched the Ardennes offensive, the German intelligence picture of American strength in that specific sector was wrong by a genuinely significant order of magnitude. Planners believed they faced a thin, brittle American line, and within roughly 72 hours of the offensive's opening, they instead found themselves fighting the better part of 9 full American divisions, with reinforcements arriving daily. The specific misjudgment had several real, documented causes: flawed assumptions about American command structure, a serious breakdown in German signal interception caused by the Allies' extensive use of buried landline communications in the West, an over-reliance on a thin and increasingly compromised network of remaining German agents behind Allied lines. But one contributing cause really was simpler than any of those and considerably harder to see coming. 4 straight years of the police call, one filled-in foxhole at a time. The men who actually wrote FM30-25 back in February 1940 never appeared in a single wartime newsreel or post-war film. Their names sit buried in the masthead of what became, functionally, an obsolete government document almost nobody remembers today. The verdict this story actually points toward isn't the one its own premise might suggest at first either. It isn't that Americans were somehow smarter or more naturally disciplined than their German counterparts. German intelligence officers of this period were genuinely capable, technically sophisticated professionals working an honest trade. The real verdict is that American planners made one specific decision early enough, well before the shooting ever started, that the decision had time to fully mature before it ever mattered in combat. That secrecy was every single soldier's job, every single day, expressed through dozens of small, individually forgettable motions. That's a meaningfully different explanation from the more familiar story of Allied victory built purely on superior wealth or raw industrial output, both true in their own right, but incomplete on their own. Some of this war was decided in genuinely small theaters, and one of them was empty foxhole somewhere in the Hürtgen Forest on a cold morning, where a German reconnaissance patrol stood looking around at absolutely nothing at all. I don't think the men who actually carry this discipline out ever needed a brilliant deception plan handed down from above. They needed exactly one order, repeated in training since their very first weeks in uniform: police the area. 2 words carried across an entire continent for 4 years by men who mostly never learned what larger purpose they were quietly serving. Sometimes the line held not with a rifle, but with a shovel, and the silence those men left behind them, silence so complete an entire enemy intelligence apparatus genuinely couldn't read it, turned out to be its own particular form of victory.